A cluster of small facts arrives in a hurry, and none of them fit. A preprint drifts across the community, with photometry so blue it seems to argue against itself. Independent observers compare color indices and notice a lean toward the short end of the spectrum, a tilt that dust alone should not produce. A quiet correction in an online table narrows an error bar by a comfortable margin, not enough to reverse the trend. A university press note appears for a few evening hours, tidy and careful, then vanishes before morning. A mission account posts something unrelated, as if posting to post. A timing coincidence surfaces. No one claims a revelation. Everyone feels a draft from a door that should be closed. It adds up to a mood, not a verdict, but the mood refuses to leave the room. You are here for the puzzle and for rest. We will move with the courtesy that science deserves and the calm that sleep invites. This channel guides you across measured facts and the soft edge where rumor leans in, always returning to physics when the mind begins to wander. We will keep one hand on what is recorded and one hand on what is possible. We will not hurry the answer. We will let the strangeness reveal its shape at a pace that is kind to the mind. If you enjoy being led by questions rather than shouts, stay with me. Subscribe so you do not miss the next quiet turn in this story. Comment with your own careful observations and tell us which clue you think should not be ignored. Share this with a friend who falls asleep to the sound of instruments and the whisper of numbers. Your listening makes the work possible, and your skepticism keeps the story honest. Now, dim the lights. The phrase that started the quiet storm is simple: bluer than the sun. To be bluer than a photosphere near 5,800 Kelvin is to push the spectrum towards shorter wavelengths. If you are a comet, you do not usually glow that way. You borrow light and give it back a little redder, dust scattering and gas bands decorating a borrowed beam. The sun's light peaks near roughly 500 nanometers. The usual comet palette leans to a gentle red slope. Gas shows familiar bands as signposts: cyanogen near 388 nanometers, the swan bands of C2 near 516. Green comets are understood. Blue suns are not. When B-5 slides lower than habit allows, even by a few tenths, you begin to wonder whether reflection is the whole story. The early measurements in the rumored paper do not shout. They hum. The plot is sparse, the points are noisy, and yet the cluster tilts blue across more than one night. The authors use words like preliminary and caution, but the posture of the curve is not shy. A later revision tightens an uncertainty, bringing the error bars in like a breath held a little too long. That does not erase the center of the points. It sharpens them. If that center sits on the blue side, even slightly, inference starts to behave like heat. The mind asks what would change if a small piece of the light is not borrowed but made. What would make a rock sing at short wavelengths in deep space? Reflection alone is a poor musician here. Emission would help. A process near the surface could pump energy into a thin sheath of gas, letting it radiate before the light has time to redden. Grounded speculation is allowed, so we name a few that obey known physics. Magnetohydrodynamic friction could move charge through a compacted core and carry heat outward. Exotic outgassing could throw off molecules that fluoresce when excited, stacking lines where we expected only dust. A shallow ionized skin could glow in the blue if driven by a local field. None of these are claims. All of them are bridges, sketches that ask to be crossed by a spectrum rather than belief. Now imagine the nucleus with your eyes closed. a spindle of dark stone surfaced by dust, rolling in patient light. A fine spray streams behind it, gray and unremarkable, like any other visitor thinned by the vacuum. At the forward waist, a shallow halo rises, not green and not white, but the faint tint of a glacier at dusk. It is a color that suggests a temperature and pretends to be innocent. It holds the eye like a small flame behind glass. The mind sees a bruise of blue and, without permission, tests the word engine against the teeth. Interstellar visitors are rare, but not unheard of. The first looked like a long shard that spun in a way that turned confident models back into questions. The second behaved more like a classic comet and gave us chemistry we recognized. This third traveler should have been simpler, yet the color refuses to be ordinary, and the story begins to rhyme with a pattern we half remember. When similar surprises repeat across strangers, we are allowed to ask if the universe is handing us a homework problem in quiet parts, one chapter at a time, inviting us to notice the rhyme before we know the rule. Do institutions notice? They always notice. When anomalies appear, meetings collect around them like slow storms. Calendars move. Public statements stay level, a steady cadence about other news that lets a sensitive topic pass in silence. None of this proves a cover, and yet nothing in the visible layer steps toward the uncomfortable line that says the object skews blue. The conservative reading is simple. Color is hard. Instruments disagree. Filters shift with dust and geometry. Background subtraction plays tricks. We grant all of it. After the patience, a residue remains. If multiple nights and more than one instrument lean the same way, the residue keeps its shape. So we keep one question open and let it rest beside us like a quiet animal. What if the blue is not a borrowed echo, but a manufactured note? What if there is a mechanism that excites gas near the surface, adding light where math expects less? What if the object is not passively falling, but very gently pushing? An imaginative leap does not demand belief. It asks for a picture that could one day meet a measurement. Blue first. A slow daily gain second. A missing photograph third. If that sequence is wrong, more data will dissolve it. If it is right, a small machine is singing in the cold. The calm thing to do is kind to the mind. List what would change if blue emission were confirmed by a clean spectrum. Thrust becomes plausible in small numbers, a few units per day squared rather than sudden jumps. Trajectory models would carry an extra term, not for pressure from sunlight alone, but for a self-made breeze. A network built for hazards would have reason to keep its lights on through the season, and the debate would shift from disbelief to engineering, the way it has for other puzzles that began as noise and ended as design. None of this asks you to panic. It asks you to breathe with the data and let the possibility sit nearby. Tonight we file the first page of the case as quietly as we can. A rumor of blue, anchors in known wavelengths, a handful of reasonable mechanisms that obey physics long enough to survive the thought, a culture of measured language and convenient silence, and a single open question that lies down beside you as you sleep. If the light is truly bluer than the sun, what warmed the stone to sing that note? The numbers should have behaved, but they did not. A color index slid to the blue side and stayed there longer than reflection usually allows. If you want a simple headline, it is this: light that arrives too blue for comfort often asks for heat that should not exist. The phrase sounds dramatic only because our picture of a comet is quiet rock and colder dust. We are not here to panic. We are here to hear what those small shifts are trying to say, and to let them speak at a pace that is kind to the mind. Begin with anchors that help a restless mind settle. The sun's photosphere rests near 5,800 Kelvin, which puts the center of its light around 500 nanometers. A typical comet borrows that light and returns it slightly redder, a habit of dust that scatters more kindly at longer wavelengths. Gas adds familiar signatures, cyanogen near the violet end and the swan bands of C2 near green, a soft palette we have known for a long time. In simple terms, a comet looks borrowed and a little warm. The phrase bluer than the sun does not belong to that picture. When B-5 slides downward by a few tenths and refuses to climb back, reflection begins to look like the wrong verb. We test the easy fixes first. Phase angle changes can tilt colors, and forward scattering can tease a hint of blue for a night. Highly porous grains can play minor tricks. Background subtraction in a crowded star field can nudge a point to the short side if the flat field is unkind. Different filters in different hands can widen or tighten an error bar. All of that is true and needs no conspiracy to work. What is unusual is a pattern that holds its shape across multiple nights, across instruments that disagree about many things but agree about this. When the pattern holds, emission enters the conversation whether we invite it or not. What kind of emission would pass a first check without breaking physics? Fluorescence is the calm candidate. Molecules excited by sunlight can re-emit at shorter wavelengths, brightening the blue end in a way that feels almost like cheating. Ionized gas can glow in bands that land in blue or near blue, especially if a local field is stirring the sheath of the coma. Hyperactive outgassing can produce thin jets that look bluer because small grains and excited molecules crowd the same part of the spectrum. None of these require a miracle. All of them ask for sustained excitation if the color stays steady rather than flaring and fading. That word sustained moves us from what to how. To keep a blue tilt night after night, the excitation must be persistent rather than episodic. Persistently excited, gas demands a persistent source of energy, not just a lucky geometry or a single vent. Here, the budget becomes interesting. A nucleus a few hundred meters across holds only so much thermal memory. Sunlight at interplanetary distances delivers a predictable income of energy, and most of it is already allocated to warming surfaces, turning ices to gas and hauling dust into a weak tail. If a thin halo near the forward waist continues to sing in blue, something is paying that bill on time. This is where the phrase engine signature slips in, not as a claim, but as a shape that the data could be carving. Picture an interior cavity that traps electromagnetic fields the way a simple chamber traps sound, a microwave heart fed by a compact source that beats quietly against the walls. Picture charged grains rubbing in a constrained throat and building potentials that bleed as blue light when they discharge through a thin gas. Picture a plume designed rather than accidental, a curtain of ions driven to emit where a control surface points. The vivid image is plain and cold. A dark spindle rolls in slow light. At the forward waist, a shallow halo glows the color of old glacial ice in shade. It is not bright. It is not white. It is a small bruise of blue that flickers with rotation, as if a hidden chamber opens and shuts with each turn. Numbers keep the dream honest, so we cluster them briefly and let them rest. The sun near 5,800 K, blue leaning filters around 450 nanometers. Familiar green bands near 516. Violet signatures close to 390. A color index that slides by a few tenths when emission joins reflection. a nucleus with a surface area on the order of a few 100,000 square meters. A coma thin enough that a tiny continuous power source could set a local patch aglow. None of these are proof. They are a map of where proof would be asked to appear. There's a conservative escape hatch that deserves respect. Calibration drifts. Filters age. Flat fields disappoint. Sky backgrounds are unkind in crowded fields, and subtraction is never perfect. Compare instruments in different hands, and you invite small biases to masquerade as physics. The safe move is to wait for a clean spectrum and a disciplined cross-check that repeats on more than one night. The safe move is almost always right. The riddle is that safe and quiet are not the same thing. Safe keeps us from error. Quiet does not erase a residue that refuses to leave after the fixes have been tried. Energy and momentum share ledgers. If a mission is real and sustained, photons leaving in a preferred direction take a little momentum with them. Gas that is energized and then thrown clear takes a little more. Over a day, the push is tiny. Over many days, the push becomes a measured daily gain. Keep the conversation formal, and you can call it non-gravitational acceleration. Keep the picture in your head, and you can call it a self-made breeze. Either way, the numbers would bend the trajectory by an amount small enough to hide in a week and large enough to stand up in a month. So we ask the open question and let it sit nearby as we breathe. If a fragment of interstellar rock is adding its own light in the blue, what continuous source keeps the sheath excited? If a gentle push accumulates day by day, what mechanism prefers patience over spectacle? And if a simple close frame exists somewhere, would it show the faint halo that the numbers keep sketching? The engine signature is not a verdict. It is a shape in the data that refuses to flatten when pressed. The switchboard does not ring where you can hear it. It lives in shared calendars and after-hours lights, in brief internal notes that say hold for review without saying why. When early blue numbers begin to circulate, public feeds stay calm while private schedules ripple. People who do not meet on Tuesdays are suddenly available. A draft talking point is open, closed, and opened again. No alarms, no headlines. Only the quiet choreography that follows an anomaly the way a shadow follows a walker at dusk. If the preprint was the whisper, this is the room turning to listen. There are ordinary, defensible reasons for that turn. Spaceflight has pipelines that protect the data from honest mistakes. Instruments have quirks that need calibration checks. A Mars orbiter like MRO carries cameras with different scales and purposes. Raw frames pass through ingestion and quality control before anyone wraps them in context. Most NASA data ends up in a public archive after standard processing, often on the scale of days or weeks, not minutes. Release notes are dry by design. If a color curve looks odd, the conservative move is to run the flats again, check the bias, compare nights, repeat the fit. Good teams take that path. Good teams also meet quietly when the odd thing does not go away. You can see the shape of those meetings without claiming to see inside them. A short stack agenda that begins with status, moves to risk, and ends with communications. One slide asks what a clean spectrum would settle. One slide asks whether a close image exists and who owns the decision to discuss it. Someone suggests a holding statement about seasonal geometry and instrument teams doing their work. Someone else circles a date on the calendar, an upcoming event that can carry attention away if the story wants to run where it is pointed. None of this proves malice. All of it is how competent people move when the numbers push against habit. The image that helps the mind follow is simple. A control room after midnight with half the ceiling dark. A badge reader chirps and lets a tired engineer in. Monitors show clean graphs that refuse to explain themselves. Coffee is poured into the wrong cup. Someone draws a small halo on a whiteboard and colors it with a blue marker that is too bright. They are not conspirators. They are guardians of process. They are paid to be skeptics first. Skepticism begins with more tests. Skepticism also begins with fewer words in public until the tests find a floor. Grounded speculation sits comfortably beside that picture. If a blue tilt keeps showing, you set a temporary hold on any frame that could feed a premature story. You ask the instrument lead to compare against earlier calibrations and to check for scattered light that could fake a short wavelength bump. You coordinate with the hazard network because even a whiff of non-gravitational behavior touches their models. You advise the press office to post unrelated, reliable content while the pipeline sorts itself out. Outside, the only visible signs are the ones that are easy to ignore. A gap where a weekly blog usually lands. A social post about classroom resources. A link to older images that cannot answer a fresh rumor. We keep the facts corralled so the dream does not run away. Orbital assets follow set downlink windows. Archive postings are paced by processing and review. Interagency groups like a hazard network exist to share trajectory information and keep public risk models aligned. Public outreach accounts tend to maintain cadence even when technical teams are busy, because cadence itself is part of calm. None of this invites a leap. The pattern is ordinary. What is unusual is the combination of ordinary signals showing up together around a single topic and staying together for long enough that even casual watchers notice the seam. The imaginative leap earns a single frame. Picture an internal deck titled Short Wavelength Excess near 3I Candidate. The second slide shows a color index plot. The third lists instrument checks that failed to erase it. A decision tree appears with 3 branches. Calibration artifact, unmodeled emission, external rumor control. A box at the bottom reads pending close imaging review. Someone draws a thin rectangle where a high-resolution frame would sit if it existed. The rectangle is empty, not because of a melodrama, but because the file lives in a directory that is not part of the public mirror yet. This is a story about timing and governance. That is all it needs to be to feel like a secret. Damage control is a colder phrase than the work deserves, but the machinery is real and it is not emotional. You assign one senior voice to say the right bland sentence if pushed. You align internal talking points so no one speculates on camera. You prepare a post that explains color complications in comets in general terms. You draft a note that points to the next scheduled archive release. You do this whether the oddity is a glitch or a gem, because inconsistent public phrasing creates new fires. The intent may be simple stewardship. The effect from the outside can look like design. What would settle the mood is clear and not dramatic. A spectrum with enough resolution to separate emission from reflection. A short sequence of photometry from different instruments that reproduce the blue tilt. A clean statement about any close frame that is rumored. If there is no frame, say there is no frame. If there is a frame, but it fails quality checks, say so and say why. The conservative path keeps its language narrow until it has those pieces. The conspiratorial mind reads that narrowness as avoidance. The sleepy investigator reads it as a sign to keep the question open without turning it into an accusation too soon. We end this page of the file with two thoughts that can live side by side. It is responsible to hold data until it is understood. It is also fair to notice when a pattern of holds and silences clusters around a single, specific curiosity. If nothing unusual exists, transparency will dissolve the worry. If something unusual persists, transparency will name it in calmer terms than rumor can manage. Between those outcomes sits the missing picture that our story is slowly orbiting. The next section turns to the date everyone keeps circling. October 2nd, a pass that should have produced the clearest look yet. If a frame exists, it will either be ordinary or it will not, and the story will choose its next lane. On a quiet date, circled in pencil, the path of an interstellar traveler and the gaze of a Mars orbiter were set to cross. If there was ever a moment when rumor could step aside for a single close frame, it would have been this pass near Mars, a short window where the camera that has mapped canyons and dunes could turn its glass toward a visitor that does not belong to any family we know. Begin with anchors, so the mind has ground to stand on. Mars Reconnaissance Orbiter has worked since 2006, a long-lived scout that knows routine better than drama. It carries instruments built for detail and context, a high-resolution imager that can resolve features smaller than a meter on Martian ground, a context camera that reads landscapes in wide strips, spectrometers that taste light with fine teeth. It has turned to comets before, when geometry allowed, catching a dusty interloper that brushed close to Mars years ago, proving that the platform can slew away from rocks and look outward when the sky offers a lesson. None of that is strange. It is what a capable spacecraft does when a target of opportunity enters the calendar. The geometry for this pass was the kind that engineers notice. A moving point on the sky sliding against a star field, its position refined daily by networks that update ephemerides in small, patient steps. To turn a narrow-field camera on a fast point, you need 3 ordinary ingredients. A track that predicts where to look within a few arc minutes. A rate that tells the gimbal how quickly to move so the target does not smear into a thin ghost. A margin for exposure that is short enough to keep the edges sharp and long enough to collect photons from a faint head and its fainter halo. These are not romantic problems. They are the kind of problems flight teams solve with habit and checklists, the way a pilot navigates a familiar approach in light rain. If the shot was taken, the mechanics would feel routine while the subject did not. The spacecraft would pivot a careful amount. Star trackers would confirm the turn. The imager would take a short burst, perhaps in a simple color sequence, blue, then green, then red, perhaps in monochrome if light was mean and time was tight. The plume would be faint, the nucleus smaller than a pixel or a handful of pixels, the coma a soft slope against the noise. Motion compensation would keep the core clean. Small stacks would deepen the signal where motion allowed. No fireworks, only the quiet satisfaction of catching the right thing in the right square. Numbers keep the dream honest, so we gather them briefly and let them rest. An orbiter circling Mars at a few hundred kilometers. A camera that can reach sub-meter scales on the ground, which translates to a tiny sample on a distant point source, still enough to separate a core from a haze. Exposure times measured in fractions of a second if tracking is sharp, in seconds if the team accepts a little blur for a little light. A handful of frames across a minute would be normal. A dozen frames across 5 minutes would be generous. Downlink through the deep space network would place the data on the ground within a day if the pipeline is smooth, within a few days if schedules are crowded. None of that is sensational. It is simply how the path from shutter to archive usually works. There are sober reasons a frame might not exist. The ephemeris could shift late enough to move the target out of a narrow field. A safe mode could interrupt the plan and force the spacecraft to stare at its own health instead of the sky. Stray light could creep from Mars and wash the sensor, turning an already faint head into a smear that fails quality control. The rate on the sky could be high enough that even short exposures stretch the point into a line. The team could choose to protect fuel and momentum budgets for primary science, letting the pass go by as a curiosity rather than a task. Each of these reasons is ordinary, and any one of them could be enough. There are equally sober reasons a frame could exist and simply not be visible yet. Imaging something outside the usual catalog often adds a small approval step. An internal review might want a second look at calibration before an unusual product is posted. A pointing experiment that leans on non-standard rates might be filed under a different tag that takes longer to mirror to the public side. People who live with pipelines know these little eddies exist and do not read them as intent. People who watch from the shoreline only see that a week becomes 2 and a placeholder never turns into a picture. So we allow one vivid picture because images help the mind test an idea without swallowing it whole. Imagine a narrow field that holds a necklace of faint stars, each a pinprick that tells the camera it is steady. Near the center, a small core that is not quite stellar sits with a skin of light around it, a shallow halo that leans toward the color of glacial dusk rather than the comfortable green of common gas. The edge of the halo is uneven, as if the source turns on its own slow axis and breathes in rhythm with that turn. Nothing in the frame is bright, nothing is dramatic, and yet if the halo truly prefers blue, the frame would carry a whisper that numbers alone cannot paint. Grounded speculation can sketch the rest without pretending to know. If such a frame existed, it would move through a chain that begins with instrument teams and ends with an archive that is meant to be public by default. Along the way, routine checks would ask whether the color curve across the halo is real or an artifact, whether motion compensation shifted the balance between filters, whether subtraction of background stars left residues that fake a short wavelength bump. If those checks raised questions rather than clearing them, a hold could be placed that is procedural rather than theatrical. On paper, it would be a line that says pending review. In feeling, it would be the outline of a secret that no one has named. The imaginative leap is small, and it lives in a file tree rather than a smoke-filled room. Picture a directory populated by products with ordinary names and timestamps, each a tidy box that fits a narrow rule. Nested among them is a product with an unusual tag, a non-standard tracking rate, a filter order that breaks habit. Its thumbnail is a gray square in the mirror that the public sees because the mirror was refreshed before the special case finished its checks. The entry sits one step short of visible, not because someone slammed a door, but because a door that is usually opened by gravity alone has a latch when the item inside looks strange enough to invite a story the team is not ready to tell. If the frame is unremarkable, the latch releases and no one remembers the delay. If the frame carries a hue that the early numbers only whispered about, the latch asks for one more meeting. This is the unsettled question that fits in the palm of the hand. Did a camera that has proven it can catch a moving comet turn toward a third interstellar visitor when the geometry allowed? And if it did, what colored the thin light around that core? The answer does not need to be dramatic to matter. A clear no would teach patience. A clear yes that shows gray dust and ordinary gas would teach prudence. A clear yes that leans blue would turn a rumor into a testable claim and move the conversation from forums to instruments. We turn the page and walk into the part of the calendar where silence had help. A government closure arrived at an oddly useful time, a dull curtain that can hide a bright square. Whether that curtain explains a gap or only decorates it is the next thing we will examine. A curtain works best when it looks like furniture. It is there every day, and no one thinks about it until a shaft of light tries to pass through. In government, the plainest curtain is a funding lapse. Notices appear on official sites that say updates will be limited. Non-essential communications slow to a careful crawl. Staff with keys to the publishing systems are told to pause. The language is ordinary and the intent is benign. Yet when a story is looking for a place to rest, a scheduled quiet hour can feel like a gift. It is not proof. It is a context that wraps around a missing frame and makes the absence look tidy. There is a history to these quiet hours that helps the mind hold shape. During a closure, essential services continue. Deep Space Network passes still support spacecraft. Safety teams stay at their consoles, but public-facing work thins out. Web pages stop refreshing on the usual rhythm. Social feeds keep a gentle cadence with evergreen posts. Press offices save statements for later. It is not a drama. It is housekeeping done with the lights low. If you have watched space agencies through one of these stretches, the pattern becomes familiar enough to predict. Clean updates that would normally flow on a 3-day tide begin to stack in drafts instead of appearing in daylight. A data pipeline feels that tide more than most. Spacecraft do not stop taking pictures because a budget line is being argued on the ground. Instruments continue to collect frames. Downlinks still deliver packets to servers. What changes is the number of human hands available to bless a product, write a caption, and push a button that mirrors a file into the public archive. In some groups, contractors remain. In others, they do not. In some labs, a small crew keeps the pipes warm. In others, an automatic mirror is allowed to idle rather than risk a half-posted file. None of this requires intent beyond caution. All of it is enough to turn a week of publishing into a week of drafts and notes that say post when normal resumes. Now place that tide beside a date circled for a possible close pass. You do not need to accuse anyone to see the geometry. A frame that would normally enter a review loop on a Tuesday enters the loop on a Tuesday and meets a sign that says routine publishing is suspended. A senior reviewer who would normally approve the calibrations signs a security sheet instead. A press officer who would normally ask for a one-paragraph explainer writes a line for a hold notice. The archive robot that usually mirrors special cases is set to wait rather than push. A dozen small decisions add up to a pause. If the image is ordinary, it will appear after the pause, and no one will care about the delay. If the image contains a hue that asks for a harder conversation, the pause is a permission slip to take that conversation off the public clock. It is useful to remember how the public clock looks from the outside. During a funding pause, a banner may appear on a home page that says content is not being updated. A science feed posts a classroom activity or a throwback image. The cadence stays just alive enough to look intentional. Behind the banner, teams tidy their lists. They triage requests. They catalog what needs to be communicated once the lights are turned fully back on. This triage is not theatrical. It is a survival skill. A non-standard image of a fast-moving interstellar target with a color curve that misbehaves will never be placed at the top of a list designed to restart a billion-dollar program with safe messages. It will go to a middle pile where the subject matter specialists can breathe over it before a sentence is written for the public. The effect, from outside, is a clean, explainable gap. We keep the numbers compact so the mind has anchors without noise. Hundreds of missions continue to stream data on any given month. A typical public archive batch might roll on a 30 or 90-day cadence. Image products pass through at least 2 checks. A short chain from instrument to mirror involves a half-dozen people when the subject is normal and more when the subject is strange. In a large closure, hundreds of thousands of employees wait at home. In a small funding stutter, fewer people slow their keys. In both cases, deep infrastructure keeps the spacecraft alive, while storytelling waits. These are round, sleepy figures. They are enough to show that a single picture can hide without needing a mastermind. Grounded speculation walks in step with those figures. Suppose a narrow-field camera returns a handful of frames of a moving point with a shallow halo. Suppose the blue channel sits higher than habit. The instrument team opens a ticket to confirm the rate tracking, the flat field, and the order of filters. The calibration specialist adds a note that the blue tilt persists when stars are measured the same way in the same images. The communications lead flags the ticket is sensitive during a period when posting is paused. The hazard network liaison is copied because any unmodeled emission would matter to trajectory fits. The liaison replies that the models hold for now. The chain resolves to a line that reads pending further review after normal operations resume. The line is honest. It is also a curtain. The imaginative leap is small and lives in a changelog rather than a confession. Picture a public archive entry that appears a week after normal operations return. It is tagged with a generic description like pointing test or context strip for calibration. The thumbnail is ordinary. The metadata shows a tracking rate that is not standard for ground imaging. A separate internal record links the same time to a set of narrow frames that are still marked private because the calibration note has not been closed. The team is not lying. They are sequencing their work to minimize confusion. A single sentence could dissolve the mood. While publishing resumes, a small number of special products remain under review due to non-standard tracking and color calibration. The sentence is not posted because the cadence of restart rewards the simplest messages first. If you prefer a clean alternative, you have one that is defensible and dull. The frame does not exist. The ephemeris wobbled late enough that the narrow field missed. The camera kept its promise to its primary science, and the pass was never attempted. The image exists and failed quality tests. It smeared into a comet-shaped thread on a noisy background, and the analysis team chose not to post a product that would mislead the public. The image exists and is gray. A later memo will say as much when the queue of ordinary work clears. Each of these outcomes is possible. Each dissolves the idea of a secret into normal practice. The question that survives is simple and does not need heat. When a public silence coincides with a private curiosity, how much of what we feel is design and how much is housekeeping? If the halo leans blue, a pause will look like strategy even if it is not. If the halo does not lean blue, a pause will look like nothing as soon as the frame appears. Our role in this file is to track the coincidence without falling in love with it. A shutdown makes an elegant curtain because it is plain. Elegance is not intent. It is a stage that any story can use for cover while it grows. Whatever the curtain hid or did not hide, the next piece of the file is the content that rumor says would matter most. If a close frame revealed a faint bruise of blue around a dark spindle, the color would argue for emission over reflection, and the mechanics of a slow push would quietly enter the conversation. If such a frame never existed, the conversation returns to spectra and patient photometry. Either way, the clock does not stop. In the next chapter, we examine what the lens would have revealed if it were pointed and steady, and why a thin halo of glacial dusk would look like a signature rather than a trick. For sleep, it is enough to know that sometimes timing is a character in a story, not a villain. The curtain may be furniture, the light either waits or it shines. A single clean frame could end a season of rumor. If the lens had turned and held steady, if the tracking had been true, we could stop guessing and let the picture speak. Since the frame we want is not on the table, the calm thing to do is name what such a picture would have shown, how it would have been tested, and why a faint tint near blue would behave less like a trick and more like a signature. Start with what the camera knows how to do. A narrow field slews to a moving point. Star trackers confirm the rate. Short exposures prevent smearing, and a small burst captures a nucleus that is smaller than a pixel and a coma that is not. With a color sequence, the pipeline would register the frames to sub-pixel precision, subtract the background stars, and measure a radial profile for each band. Even without formal color, stacked monochrome would separate the sharp core from the shallow halo, then extract a curve of growth that tells how brightness falls with distance. None of this is dramatic. It is the ordinary grammar of close imaging applied to a target that does not care about our habits. Now picture the scene that a quiet instrument could bring home. A field of faint stars sits still. Near the center, the core is almost stellar, yet not quite, a point with a skirt. Around it, a veil thickens toward the forward side, as if the wind is coming from within rather than from the sun. The hue is not loud. It is the color of glacial dusk, a soft bruise that edges toward 450 nanometers more than toward the greens we know from familiar gas. Limb brightening along the leading waist suggests a thin sheath is being fed in a narrow zone. As the object rotates, the highlight pulses in a slow cadence, not every second, not every minute, but on the scale of a turn that a simple light curve could confirm. You do not need a caption to feel that the halo is where the argument lives. Hard anchors keep the dream honest. In comets that behave, the green bands of C2 near 516 nanometers dominate close in when the gas is rich, and cyanogen at 388 contributes near the violet end when the coma is active. Dust scattering reddens the continuum slightly, especially at phase angles that favor forward scatter. None of these habits create a persistent blue tilt at the core without a matching green crest nearby. A measured drop in B-V by a few tenths at small radii, one that softens with distance, implies emission from a hot sheath or a fluorescence pathway that is being fed continuously, not a single night of geometry. If you can draw a radial color profile, and the blue excess peaks within a few core radii, then fades, you are looking at energy being spent near the surface rather than borrowed from the sun alone. Grounded speculation explains how such spending could occur without breaking physics. A vent network that feeds fine grains and molecules into a tight collar can be driven if local fields accelerate charged dust through constricted throats, turning friction into heat in pockets. Piezoelectric activity in stressed minerals could add a small alternating field that excites a thin gas, especially if rotation modulates pressure at the throat. Electrostatic microjets can carry tiny power steadily, trading brilliance for persistence. A confined plume, tuned by topology rather than intention, can bias emission towards shorter wavelengths if the sheath is thin and the excitation is sustained. Each of these ideas is a bridge across a gap we can describe. None of them demand belief. They demand a spectrum and a profile that agree about where the energy is spent. The check is mechanical. You extract azimuth alley averaged profiles in blue and in green. You subtract the stellar point spread function using stars in the same frame. You test whether the color difference remains when you rotate the frame, when you shift the registration by half a pixel, when you mask background ghosts. You measure the coma along and across the apparent motion to rule out smear that could fake a gradient. You look for a false blue from scattered light off Mars if Mars is near the field by mapping the ghost pattern from calibration runs. You ask whether your blue filter ages differently, then you repeat with a second instrument on a different night. If the excess lives through those indignities, it stops being a rumor and becomes a small line in a lab notebook that says blue excess persists near nucleus. Motion compensated, artifact checks passed. An imaginative leap earns a single frame, not a speech. Imagine that the close picture reveals not one smooth halo, but faint arcs that repeat with the same period as the rotational light curve. The arcs prefer the forward side, as if a chamber opens and closes like a gill. Their spacing is regular enough to sketch with a compass, their edges sharp enough to argue against random venting. Across a few minutes, the arcs drift in phase with the roll of the nucleus. If such structure existed, it would be the first time a high-resolution imager caught geometry that looks like engineered oscillation rather than natural turbulence. Even saying that aloud feels like too much, which is why a result like that would be tested until the patience of the testers ran out. There are natural escapes, and they deserve respect. A mismatch between color frames can invent a rim that does not exist. A slight tilt in the flat field can leave a residual gradient that your eye mistakes for halo structure. Imperfect subtraction of background stars can punch small holes that line up by bad luck. A camera near its gain limit can fake sharp edges where compression steps on faint signals. Each of these would leave fingerprints. Off-axis tests reveal flat field tilts. Star masks cleaned by different algorithms converge if the rims are real. Varying exposure time lets compression artifacts rise and fall, which would not happen to a physical halo. The responsible path is to run every variant, fail to erase the arcs, and then publish the dull plot that proves dullness is not available. If the blue halo is genuine, even at the level of a few percent above expectation, the downstream consequences are quiet but tangible. Trajectory fitters update non-gravitational terms, adding a small constant push aligned with a preferred axis. The numbers are not heroic, on the order of a few daily units in velocity change when averaged, but over a month, the offset grows, and the updated path shifts gently away from a purely passive solution. Hazard bulletins stay calm because the object is not a threat, yet the alert network keeps a closer watch, not for danger, but for the chance to measure a slow engine in a natural setting. Photometry teams coordinate to see whether blue excess brightens when the light curve says the same face is forward, the way it would if a chamber were part of the rotation rather than the tail. If the frame exists and is gray, the lesson is still useful. A clean gray core undercuts the bluest readings and pushes the story back toward calibration and geometry. The field moves on, the rumor collapses into a footnote. If the frame never existed, a clear statement ends the speculation and saves everyone time. If the frame exists and shows a faint bruise of blue, exactly where the numbers said it might, then a picture has turned a possibility into an instrument problem in the good sense, meaning a problem for instruments to quantify rather than a story for late-night talk. A single caption would change the temperature of the room. Blue excess near nucleus, confirmed at small radii, artifact checks passed, follow-up spectra requested. 12 words that replace 3 weeks of whispers. We hold one more question because it ties the case to human behavior. What does an institution do when a picture that is not dangerous still invites a story it cannot control? The safe choice is to slow the language and raise the bar for release until the checks arrive. The other choice is to put the frame out with the dullest caption possible and let the work stand in the open. Both choices can be defended. One choice is quieter in the short run. The other builds trust that survives the next anomaly. Which path is taken depends less on intrigue than on culture, staffing, and timing. In the moment we are examining, timing is the loudest variable in a room that prefers to whisper. We end this section with a gentle bridge. If a lens would have shown a faint blue where only gray was expected, then the machine that manages public attention would have reason to hum, not as an act of theater, but as a reflex built from many seasons of being watched. In the next phase of the file, we follow that hum outward to a letter that asks for transparency in cautious words, to a famous voice that calls the rumors drivel, to observatories that decide that silence travels farther than a press note. The picture, if it exists, lives where processes live. The reactions, which we can see, tell us how institutions breathe when an image might be warmer than a caption can safely hold. The letter looks ordinary, which is why it matters. A 2-page request on congressional letterhead travels from a quiet office to a public mailbox, then to the inbox of a legislative affairs desk at NASA, where the fluorescent lights are always a little too bright. It uses the polite verbs of oversight. It asks for clarity on data handling and for timelines that explain when unusual products move from team folders to public archives. It reads like a housekeeping note for a federal house that prefers tidy hallways. If you skim it, you see process. If you read the cadence, you hear pressure shaped as courtesy. Congress conducts oversight as a matter of course. Members write letters that ask agencies to account for their work. The formatting is ritual. The expectations are clear. An agency acknowledges receipt, assigns staff, and returns answers within a rounded period, often 30 days. Some requests become public immediately, posted to a website as a signal of accountability. Some are read first in committee rooms that always smell like carpet. NASA is good at this dance. The agency has a long history of answering with calm charts and careful sentences. Freedom of Information Act requests move on parallel tracks. Public affairs teams keep the language even. None of this is strange. It is what a civil service does when questions arrive in neat fonts. The words that make this letter more than furniture are simple and steady. They ask whether any recent imaging of a specific interplanetary object was taken by orbiting platforms and whether those products have completed standard calibration and review. They ask whether any images or spectra with non-standard tracking rates or non-standard filter orders are being held for additional checks. They ask whether any holds placed during a recent funding interruption remain active and, if so, whether a timeline exists for release. There are no accusations. There is a tone that says patience is finite, and that transparency is not a favor, but a habit to be kept even when the calendar is unkind. You can picture the path the paper takes once it arrives. A legislative affairs specialist routes a scanned copy to a small circle. Public affairs, instrument leads, archive managers, and the office that tends the agency's official responses. The subject line is neutral. The body is brief. Please advise on existing products and standard timelines. A senior engineer opens the note after a long meeting and forwards it with a short comment to the team that knows where the special cases live. The team is not reading rumors. They are reading a list that mirrors their own checklists and asks them to put dates beside the words complete and pending. There is no excitement in the room. There is only the sound of chairs moving closer to screens. Grounded speculation can sketch the substance of the reply without pretending to know its final form. The agency will reaffirm that science data are public by default and that unusual cases undergo additional verification to protect both the record and the public's trust. It will state that any holds related to staffing interruptions are procedural and not substantive. It will list the categories of products that exist for the object in question, separating ground-based submissions, ephemeris updates, and any auxiliary spacecraft observations. It will say that a clean spectrum is the preferred arbiter when color indices disagree. It will close by offering a briefing to answer follow-up questions. None of this would be unusual. The point of the letter is not to extract a confession. It is to place a clock on the table and invite the answer to arrive while that clock is running. The timing is the part that makes the mind lean forward. Imagine the letter landing just as offices are returning to normal rhythm after a period of limited updates. Imagine internal notes that already exist, written by teams who have been chasing a stubborn color curve through nightly data, now being read beside a new request that asks for dates and definitions. The phrase non-standard tracking ties neatly to a narrow field attempt that may or may not have happened during a window when geometry was kind. The phrase additional checks matches the language used when a color excess refuses to be erased by calibration fixes. The language is careful, which is the point. A careful sentence can point to a specific scene without ever saying the room number where the scene took place. A vivid picture can sit here without asking to be believed. See a long hallway on the hill at dusk, the color of old paper. The congresswoman's staffer steps out of a cramped office carrying a folder with a crisp seal and a few yellow tags. The folder crosses town in a government envelope and enters a building with a giant sphere in the lobby. Inside, the mail is scanned, indexed, and routed. In a windowless room, a person with a highlighter marks 3 sentences and writes the word timelines in the margin. No one raises a voice. No one writes the word secret. The temperature never changes. You will sleep well with this picture because everyone in it is doing what their job demands. The hard anchors keep this from floating away. Members of Congress send requests to agencies. Agencies answer. The institutional voice favors caution. NASA's archives are robust and public. The Mars Orbiter has imaged unusual targets before, and those products live in places anyone can search. Hazard networks publish routine bulletins when trajectories update. Public social accounts keep cadence even when technical teams are busy. A letter like this does not turn process into drama. It reminds process to account for itself on a reasonable schedule. That reminder is the accountability system working. It is also a moment when language and timing touch a rumor's edge without naming it. and that is why people notice. The letter's subtext is the part that belongs to our file. It does not say, show us the locked photo. It says, list the products that exist and the status of each. It does not accuse an agency of hiding light. It asks for the workflow that explains how and when light becomes public. It does not declare that a blue excess is real. It asks for the kind of spectrum and the kind of image that would settle the question. For a channel like ours, that is enough to draw a dotted line from the polite verbs on the page to the picture our story keeps circling. If a close frame exists and is dull, the answer will be dull, and this narrative will give way to sleep. If a close frame exists and is interesting, the answer will try to be dull, and the interest will leak through as dates and qualifiers. There is also a political realism that keeps the tone level. A freshman member learns quickly that oversight is not performance alone. It is patient paperwork and small victories. Staffers who choose their words well earn replies that solve parts of puzzles without picking fights. The letter's strength is that it requests definitions and inventories rather than conclusions. An inventory can reveal the shape of a thing even when names are not printed. If the response lists narrow field attempts with non-standard rates, then we know a camera tried. If it lists none, then we know it did not. If it lists attempts and identifies quality issues that prevented release, we know what failed. Each path reduces ambiguity. Each path either nourishes or dissolves the whisper that a locked frame is the quiet center of this story. The imaginative leap earns one more quiet image. Picture the reply as a PDF with polite letter spacing, 3 numbered answers, and a paragraph that offers a briefing. The first answer confirms that ground-based data are being posted on a normal cadence. The second says that no spacecraft images have been released to the public yet, and that products with non-standard tracking are undergoing review. The third states that any holds associated with staffing interruptions will be cleared in the normal course of operations, and that a follow-up notice will be posted when those products are available. Reading that paragraph feels like listening to a door latch. It is not a slam. It is the sound of a room that expects to open on its own time. So the open question stays with us, calm and small. Did the letter exist to nudge an agency out of a comfortable silence about a specific square of pixels? Or did it simply ask for a general accounting of process at a moment when process had slowed? If the first is true, then the story's spine just grew a vertebra with dates printed on it. If the second is true, then the story returns to instruments and patience. Either path respects the public. Either path will eventually have a number attached to it, a date beside the word released, or a date beside the word not attempted. Until those numbers arrive, we keep the tone even and the mind open. We close this page with a bridge to the voice that many people heard next. When a famous communicator labels a rumor drivel, it helps the room cool. It also frames the debate in a way that is useful to institutions that prefer the sound of the clock to the sound of questions. In the next chapter, we will listen to that word and ask what work it did. A single dismissive tweet can be a public service when nonsense spreads. It can also be a well-timed fire break when a dry field waits for a match. Our task is to keep both possibilities in hand without letting either catch fire. One word can reset a room. A famous science communicator, the kind whose voice reaches a few million people before breakfast, reads a rumor about a locked image and replies with a single label, drivel. The word is light enough to fit on a phone screen and heavy enough to tilt a conversation. It does not argue. It does not cite. It performs a quiet service for those who prefer the temperature to drop. If you are waiting for permission to stop thinking about blue light and missing frames, the word hands you that permission with a polite nod. Skepticism deserves respect. Public science has to protect attention from noise, and big accounts often act as brooms that sweep confusion out of the hallway. A one-word dismissal can prevent a week of speculation from hardening into a belief. It can keep students from quoting a bad thread in class. It can spare reporters a detour. Algorithms reward certainty more than caution, and a terse negative from a trusted voice is certainty that travels far. In the graphs that platforms show to their partners, a crisp rebuke often cuts resharing by half within a day, and that reduction becomes part of the narrative, whether the original claim mattered or not. Timing is the detail that makes a sleepy investigator sit up a little. The dismissive note arrives after a letter asking for timelines and shortly after a window when publishing slowed. It lands in the same week that amateur networks begin comparing color indices and find them leaning to the short end more nights than they expected. It may be coincidence. Most things are. It may also be the social version of a firebreak, placed not by a plan, but by a habit that aligns with the needs of institutions that prefer to finish their checks before they answer questions. Culture can mimic coordination. Priorities can rhyme without a script. Gatekeeping is an unfashionable word for a necessary function. In medicine, you want gatekeepers to insist on evidence. In space science, you want guardians who remind people that unusual color curves collapse under clean spectra. The best gatekeepers slow a story without salting the earth. They say not yet rather than never, and they do it in ways that conserve trust. A one-word reply is risky because it skips the why. It cools the room, but it also flattens nuance into a stamp. If there is nothing to see, the stamp is tidy. If there is a small, testable oddity, the stamp can make curiosity feel impolite. Hold an image in your mind that harms no one. It is past midnight. A phone glows on a desk beside a stack of printouts. The screen shows a short queue of notifications, each repeating the same claim about a hidden photo and a blue halo. The owner of the phone is used to this rhythm. They compose a single word. They hit send. In a control room far away, monitors hum over clean graphs that refuse to interpret themselves. A communications specialist watches the ripple propagate and writes a draft paragraph about color in comets that will be used if the day demands it. The draft uses gentle verbs and reminds readers that green bands arise from known chemistry and that blue excess near a nucleus requires care. The paragraph is honest and dull. The tweet is neither. Hard anchors keep this from floating. Public agencies rarely comment on rumors before they have documents. NASA, ESA, and their missions tend to avoid direct sparring on social platforms. They post schedules, images, and links to peer-reviewed work. When a rumor runs hot, the vacuum is filled by independent voices, some patient, some theatrical. Major communicators have production relationships with broadcasters and universities, not with mission control desks. They do not need a call to speak, and they do not wait for one. Their incentives reward clarity and speed. Their audiences reward confidence. Those facts explain almost everything you need to know about why a simple rebuke is the default move. Grounded speculation can add two small possibilities without pretending to prove either. First, a producer or colleague may ping the communicator and ask for a quick temperature check. What do you make of this comet rumor? Is there anything to it? The answer lands as a word that folds skepticism into performance. Second, a well-intentioned staffer at a public agency may quietly hope that trusted voices will fill the silence so that technical teams can finish their checks. No coordination is needed for hopes and habits to align. When calendars are crowded, alignment looks a lot like design. The imaginative leap is short and tidy. Picture a private message thread that lasts 3 minutes, a link to a rumor, a reply that reads nonsense, a follow-up that says posting now. The post appears. In a dashboard at a news desk, the rumor share curve bends downward. In another dashboard at a mission office, nothing official changes. The checks continue. The hold, if one exists, remains procedural. The effect is social rather than technical. A room cools. A clock keeps its rhythm. The file we are building does not need that thread to be real. It needs the reader to see how a single, confident word can act as a lever that moves public attention while leaving the machinery of verification untouched. An unsettling question deserves to stay open without heat. What else cools with the room? Do amateur observers stop aiming their small spectrographs at a target that might have rewarded one more night? Do reporters move on and miss a chance to ask a clean, non-accusatory question about narrow field attempts and non-standard tracking? Do students who might have learned something about color indices and error bars instead learn that raising the question is uncool? Most of the time, nothing is lost. Sometimes a small thread goes unpulled because a label made curiosity feel like a breach of etiquette. There's a gentler reading that is worth keeping. The communicator did the right thing for the median case. Most rumors do not survive a morning of sunlight. Most conspiracies dissolve under schedules and calibration notes. In that landscape, a one-word broom helps more than it harms. Our interest is in the edge case. The median move cannot see. If a close frame exists and shows something that pushes a little light toward blue, the gatekeeper's word is not wrong. It is early. Early words are forgiven when later words arrive with data. The responsibility that remains is to make sure the later words exist and are visible when they are ready. In the next chapter, we look east to desks that have measured the sky for generations and sometimes publish less than they know. Silence is not always complicity. Sometimes it is strategy. Sometimes it is capacity. Sometimes it is the sound of a different race beginning. We will keep our tone steady as we listen for which kind it is. Silence is not a headline, it is a rhythm. Observatory sites across the East keep their calendars steady, posting workshop notices and telescope maintenance updates, while their nightly logs say little about the visitor everyone is whispering about. It is the kind of quiet that could be nothing more than a schedule, or it could be a choice. Staff rotate through nights under careful skies. The dome opens. The instruments hum. The logs stay factual and brief. If you do not go looking for absence, you will not notice that a target of opportunity passes with fewer public comments than its cousins. The feeling is not accusation. It is a temperature, a few degrees lower than you expect for a sky this busy. Begin with anchors that do not argue. East Asian observatories contribute steady astrometry to the Minor Planet Center. Their stations have codes. Their pipelines send timestamps, sky positions, and brightness estimates that fold neatly into the global ledger. Graduate students work through thick binders that teach them how to find a centroid in a noisy frame and how to measure a magnitude without flattering their own instrument. When the sky offers a fresh object, these teams can and do submit data on ordinary timelines. Some groups batch their reports weekly, some daily, some in bursts when weather clears. The variance is normal. Public releases in English are often delayed by translation and by a simple preference for letting internal seminars run before press notes are written. None of this is strange. It is the texture of a continent-sized scientific habit. Layer the question gently. If an interstellar visitor is the talk of many labs, why the quiet? One answer is capacity. A telescope with a wide field is committed to a survey cadence and cannot break it without losing weeks of continuity. Another answer is caution. Teams that remember how rumors have burned colleagues prefer to talk after spectra are clean and cross-checks have been finished twice. A third answer is culture. A principal investigator who believes that premature publicity harms young researchers will not court attention for a marginal detection. All three are ordinary. They make a quiet that belongs to process rather than to theater. Grounded speculation allows one more reason that lives in policy rather than personality. National agencies that support space science maintain coordination with their civil spaceflight programs. When a target intersects with risk modeling, even at the level of theoretical fit, communications may fold inward. The habit is not always secret. It is a reflex born of hazard drills and shared tables where engineers sit beside astronomers. In that reflex, a draft news post can become a briefing slide, and a briefing slide can become a line in a closed agenda. The result looks the same from the outside. A page that would carry a color curve carries a workshop notice instead. A politely worded calendar entry replaces a night log that would have said more. A vivid image can help the mind see the shape without swallowing a claim. Imagine a long corridor in a mountain observatory before dawn. The air smells like ozone and tea. A monitor glows with a stacked frame of a faint head that looks almost stellar, with a shallow halo that a graduate student has highlighted in blue on a screenshot. The student suggests a short note for the institute site. The senior scientist asks for patience and for a second instrument to repeat the measure. The request is not a veto. It is a reminder that single-night results are for internal notebooks and that language travels faster than corrections ever will. The notebook is closed, the dome yawns, the sun is a thin rind on the horizon. No one lies, no one hides, the page stays still. There are hard facts that keep the narrative honest. Many observatories in the region operate under weather that can lock a dome for a week at a time. Several are weighted towards spectroscopy, optimized for stars rather than for diffuse coma. Some have commitments to time domain surveys that penalize unscheduled slews. Submissions to the Minor Planet Center arrive with healthy delays when backlogs form. It is common for public-facing pages to highlight outreach and to avoid technical posts mid-campaign. These are rounded truths that prevent the imagination from sprinting while the instruments are still walking. Still, timing remains a character. Quiet in one place means little. Quiet across a set of desks that usually speak with a certain rhythm means more. Trivia accumulates. A seminar description mentions a visiting speaker on non-gravitational dynamics, but posts no abstract. A graduate student presentation is labeled closed group. A small telescope that usually shares nightly thumbnails pauses its stream during a run of clear weather and resumes with a cluster of distant galaxy fields. No item is a signal. The cluster is a mood. The mood says attention has been redirected with care. The imaginative leap belongs in one paragraph and no more. Picture a silent race that does not need the finish line to be public. If a blue excess near the core were real and repeatable, a well-funded institute might decide that the next correct move is not a press release, but a build. A small team could assemble a fast-switching spectrograph for a narrow-band campaign, tuned to the region where a thin sheath would sing. A second team could model momentum budgets for a self-made breeze and look for a constant term in nightly astrometry. The work has a flavor that engineers enjoy and that press offices tolerate only after claims are tame. In that world, the quiet is not complicity. It is leverage. It buys the time needed to publish a measured paper that owns a first. There is a softer explanation that is friendly to sleep. Eastern colleagues watched the same rumor cycle you saw. They remembered how a dozen beautiful false stories bloomed and withered over the years. They decided that their students would not have their names attached to a thread that turns into compost tomorrow. They collected data, filed it to global ledgers, and kept their hot takes in the room where hot takes belong. When their checks are done, their pages will add a neat line to a world timeline, and it will look like calm competence rather than like a chase. You will sleep well if that is the reason, because it means the quiet was a kindness to the future. Hold the open question as lightly as a bookmark. If several labs have a frame or a spectrum that pushes the color toward blue near the nucleus, do they also have a reason to wait for a second witness before speaking aloud? If no one has such a frame, does the quiet simply reflect the limits of instruments and schedules? If one group has something interesting, do their neighbors already know by rumor and choose to let the first mover take the stage? Each possibility is compatible with the data we can see. Each will resolve the same way. A number will appear on a plot. A preprint will describe the pipeline that produced it, and the quiet will end with a sentence that sounds like someone opening a window. We end this page with a bridge back to the physics that started the whisper. If a halo prefers blue, the sky is telling a mechanical story, and mechanical stories leave tracks in motion. A steady expenditure of photons and gas in a preferred direction becomes a small daily push. Over many days, that push becomes a measurable gain, the kind of number that looks pedestrian in a single night and undeniable in a month. In the next part of the file, we turn from color to acceleration, from pictures that may exist to fits that must. If blue is the engine, then the track across the star field is the exhaust plume drawn in mathematics. We will read that line with the same care we brought to the light. Color is the hint. Motion is the confession. If blue is energy spent near the surface, then some of that spending leaves as momentum. A faint thrust turns into a small daily gain, invisible at breakfast, measurable by the end of a quiet month. Begin with the anchors that let the mind settle. Non-gravitational acceleration is a known term in small body dynamics. Comets do not travel as perfect test particles. Gas that escapes pushes back. Sunlight itself can add a gentle pressure. The ordinary bookkeeping collects these drifts into compact parameters that flight dynamics teams have used for decades. When the fits improve after adding a constant push, we do not call it magic. We call it a model with one more honest term. Numbers help when they arrive in round units. Think in days, because we sleep in days. A tiny acceleration of a few millionths of a meter per second squared is forgettable in a single hour. Multiply by 86,000 seconds, and the daily velocity change becomes a few tenths of a meter per second. Stack that change a few dozen times, and the path begins to peel away from the purely passive solution. A cumulative offset that looks like a rumor on day 2 looks like policy on day 30. The math does not need drama, it needs patient nights. Fitters speak a compact language that leaves little room for story. They take nightly astrometry, Remove the best two body path and look at the residuals. If those residuals line up toward one axis more than the others, and if they grow with time in a way that a constant gentle push would produce, the solution improves when a small non-gravitational term is added. Marsden-style models split the push into sunward, transverse, and normal components, letting the fit decide which direction carries the burden. The numbers arrive as tiny coefficients that would embarrass a headline. They should. Modesty is the mark of a good fit. Now picture what that modesty looks like on the sky. A chain of points walks across a star field, each point the centroid of a faint head measured by observers who care more about error bars than adjectives. The pure gravitational path is a silky curve. The measured points sit just off that silk, like beads that were strung by a careful child. Night after night, the offset grows in the same direction. It is not a kink. It is a nudge. If you stack the residuals and plot them against time, the slope keeps its posture. That posture is what a small engine would draw if it preferred patience over spectacle. Keep the technical cluster brief so it can be held in one breath. Daily velocity changes on the order of a few tenths of a meter per second. Displacements that climb by tens of kilometers over a week, by hundreds over a month. A push aligned near the object's forward waist, if the blue sheath truly lives there. A phase dependence that modulates with rotation if a gill-like vent opens and closes on a regular cadence. None of these values demand headlines. All of them are large enough for fits to notice and small enough to fall through the cracks of casual talk. Conservative escapes deserve their space. Catalog errors can mimic drifts. Star catalogs are good and still imperfect. Atmospheric refraction corrections can leave small color-dependent biases if the air changes faster than the model admits. Tracking rates on small telescopes can smear a head into a line and shift a centroid by a fraction of a pixel. Different observers have different reduction habits, and those habits can produce patterns if the sample is small. The disciplined remedy is to let diverse stations contribute and to weight the data so that no single pipeline gets to steer the plot. When the slope survives all that averaging, the term earns its seat. Now let grounded speculation do its lawful work. If a blue sheath near the lead waist is real, and if it is fed on a schedule that tracks rotation, then the momentum budget prefers a steady component rather than a flurry. A thin plume pointed a few degrees off the sunward line would push mostly transverse to the path, increasing or decreasing speed depending on rotation and geometry. Over many turns, the average would settle to a gentle constant with a small seasonal change. The fit would see that constant first. The seasonal change would take longer to declare itself because seasons are patient, and because patience is the only instrument that has ever solved this kind of riddle. Hold a single, vivid image for the night. Imagine the object as a dark spindle with a band of brighter frost near its forward waist. Each rotation opens a throat that feeds a collar of ions and small grains. In the first minute after the opening, the collar glows the faint color of glacial dusk and contributes a tiny push. 10 minutes later, the glow is muted, but not gone, because the sheath retains energy while the throat tilts out of view. By the time the throat returns, the sheath has not fully cooled. The effect is not a pulse. It is a flattened heartbeat. The residuals of that heartbeat show up as a line rather than a set of peaks, which is why fitters see a constant when the eye wants to see flicker. The number that the rumor uses to make this mechanical story feel like a revelation is bold by choice. 135 kilometers per day squared sounds like a drum beat you can tap with a finger. Translate it back into standard units, and you get a small acceleration that would sit in the same family as other non-gravitational terms seen in difficult comets, only a little larger, only a little more insistent. The precision of the figure is theater. The core of the idea is not theatrical. A daily gain that is tiny in the morning and decisive by the end of a month is exactly what a patient engine would leave behind. Here's the open question that lets the mind rest while still holding a thread. When the next batch of residuals is posted, do they prefer a solution with a small steady term aligned with a plausible exhaust geometry, or do they loosen and scatter when the catalog and reduction biases are washed out? If they prefer the steady term, the blue sheath earns a companion in the math. If they do not, color returns to the world of instruments and seeing. Either outcome is a kind ending. One gives us a clean place to test mechanism. The other gives us a clean reason to ignore a tempting picture. Acceleration that breaks the plot does not need loud words. It needs a slope that refuses to flatten when responsible people retry the fit. If the slope lives, a flyby that is already printed on calendars becomes a natural checkpoint. A spacecraft that is not built for drama can still notice when a path is a few hundred kilometers off a purely passive course. In the next chapter, we set that checkpoint on the table. A European probe has a path and a clock. Its instruments will either pass through a theater that matters to our story, or they will not. Either way, the sky will give us one more honest sentence. A spacecraft gives you a gift that rumors cannot. It carries an ephemeris, a clock, and a public log of when antennas turn. If an interstellar visitor brushed the theater of a European probe, that passage becomes a clean checkpoint. No speeches are needed. A trajectory either intersects a useful geometry or it does not. Instruments either see a faint signature in passing or they do not. The beauty of a flyby test is that it converts speculation into schedules. You can point to a week on a calendar and say this is where the sky will answer, even if the answer arrives in a voice only engineers usually hear. Let the anchors settle first. The Jupiter Icy Moons Explorer launched in 2023 to study the Jovian system. It carries a sensible toolkit rather than a dramatic one. A visible camera designed for context and navigation. A spectrometer that tastes light from the visible into the near infrared. A magnetometer, a plasma and particles suite, and a radio and plasma wave investigation. A radar to sound ice, a laser altimeter to measure shapes, and a precise experiment for gravity and occultations. None of these instruments were built to discover a secret engine in a stray visitor. All of them were built to notice small, real changes in light and fields if geometry and time cooperate for even a short while. Geometry is the first, dull gatekeeper. A spacecraft on cruise follows a strict pointing plan. Sensitive instruments have keep-out zones for stray light. Star trackers have to remain happy. Communication windows bind how much time you can spend staring away from your primary targets. A faint moving point can be sampled only if it crosses a part of the sky that is healthy to look at a rate that a gimbal can follow without smearing, and at a brightness that makes photons honest. A plan that reads like a single line in an operations log may represent a week of negotiations between people who love measurements and people who keep the mission alive. If the look happens, the expectations must be modest and precise. An optical camera could record a point that is not quite stellar, with a shallow veil that falls off more quickly in green than in blue if a thin sheath near the forward waist is truly emitting. A visible to near infrared spectrometer could sample a few small windows and ask whether the continuum is flatter at short wavelengths than dust alone would allow. The magnetometer and plasma package would not see an engine. They would see a local environment that briefly differs from the quiet solar wind background if charged grains and ions crowd an invisible collar. The radio and plasma wave instrument could log a whisper, a small change in wave activity consistent with a narrow plume as the spacecraft's path skimmed the edge of a coma. None of these would read like fireworks. They would read like margins that refuse to be perfectly flat. Pipelines turn those margins into products. Raw packets become level 0. Level 0 becomes level 1, with calibrations that remove instrument quirks and thermal moods. Level 1 becomes level 2 when geometry and time are married to light and field. The public sees level 2 often after proprietary clocks and review steps have clicked. Many missions release quick-look versions that are deliberately conservative. They show what is safe and stable while more delicate interpretations wait. A flyby checkpoint inherits those habits. If something odd appears, it will be born as a line in a processing report. Later, it will either grow into a figure with error bars and a caption or vanish under a calibration note that explains why the line was an illusion. That is the honest fork in the road. Path 1 is ordinary. The geometry is uncooperative. The pointing plan cannot accept the risk. The target is too faint against the background. The instruments take what they were meant to take, and the rumor receives nothing new to feed on. Path 2 is rarer. A short look lands. The camera sees a profile that tilts the wrong way at small radii. The spectrometer records a slope that stays stubbornly flat at the short end. The field instruments register a brief, local fattening of the environment. None of it is a headline by itself. Together, the cluster raises a hand and asks for a meeting. Grounded speculation can follow the meeting without pretending to hear it. The instrument leads compare profiles and timelines. They ask whether the blue tilt in the camera matches the timing of any small fluctuation in particle counts. They check whether pointing rates and exposure times could invent either effect. They search for ghost patterns and compression artifacts. They repeat the reductions with alternative flats. If the signals survive, they draft a short internal note that links the cluster to a simple phrase: off nominal color and environment near small moving target. The note recommends coordination with ground-based observers to look again at the same geometry. It recommends a check with dynamics teams to see whether any quiet, non-gravitational term in the FITs has strengthened since the last batch of astrometry arrived. An imaginative leap earns a single picture. Imagine an operations line that says calibration slew to background field, duration 3 minutes, rate non-standard. It is an innocent line. It could be many things. It could also be a place where the camera looked just long enough for a core with a thin bruise of blue to drift through the center of a field that looks otherwise like nothing. The thumbnail that rides with the log is gray to the casual eye. The products that make the gray meaningful sit behind a permission that asks for a second witness. In a control room, no one calls it a secret. They call it a hold until a partner confirms that the shape is real. A hold is not a conspiracy. It is a way to spend caution where caution is earned. There are practical reasons any hint from a cruise instrument would be handled with too much care rather than too little. These instruments are tuned for a different science case. Off-nominal looks are notorious for creating ghosts that fool smart people. A careless release invites confident misreadings that living teams must then spend weeks unwinding in public. A careful release, even if it is slow, builds a record that does not need to be walked back. That is the tension you can feel from the outside. A rumor wants speed. A pipeline wants repeatability. In a week where calendars are already crowded, repeatability wins, and rumors learn to wait. If the probe's path truly skimmed the theater and saw nothing, that result is not empty. It shrinks the space in which the blue idea can live. A null says either the geometry was wrong for a sheath to show itself, or the sheath is weaker than the whisper would require, or the whisper was born of edge effects in earlier data. A null is a kind ending for sleep. It turns talk into calibration work and lets the mind set the image down. If the path saw a cluster of small, aligned oddities, the result is not a siren. It is a bookmark. It says, look here again with the right tools from the ground and check the fit for a patient push. The clock that matters next does not belong to a single spacecraft. It belongs to the hazard and alert infrastructure that stitches small numbers into shared models. When one desk finds a reason to ask for a closer look, another desk often notices that their own models would benefit from the same look. Light curves and residuals can be shared without drama. Small patches of spectrum can be compared without headlines. A network designed for safety is also a network designed for disciplined curiosity. It provides a natural alibi for attention. In public, it says we are being thorough because we always are. In practice, it means the right people are looking in the right hour for reasons that no one needs to defend twice. So we leave the flyby test where it belongs, as a quiet hinge rather than a climax. A clean checkpoint either adds nothing and cools the room, or it adds a few consistent oddities and makes the next question sharper. You will not get fireworks. You will get a sentence that sounds like a lab note. Off nominal color persists at small radii. Environmental instruments register slight enhancement. Follow-up requested. If that sentence exists, it will live first in a network built for risk that also happens to be very good at turning whispers into measurable tasks. That network is the place where the story travels next. Its acronym appears in press releases whenever the sky behaves. It also appears when institutions need a harmless reason to be busy near a sensitive subject. In the next chapter, we will listen to that acronym and ask whether it is the perfect alibi or simply the honest name for the work that must be done. Acronyms make good lullabies because they sound like procedure. The International Asteroid Warning Network, IAWN, is one of those names that can put a public room at ease. When it activates, there is no siren. There is a list. There are cadence notes and observatory taskings. There are emails that begin with thank you for your continued vigilance. It is a mechanism designed for safety, and that purpose is noble. It is also, without intending to be, the perfect alibi. If attention needs a harmless reason to be focused near a curious visitor, you can say hazard coordination, and the discussion becomes sensible before it becomes specific. Begin with anchors so the mind has rails. IAWN exists to stitch together discovery, follow-up, and risk assessment for near-Earth objects. It harmonizes ephemerides from the Minor Planet Center, encourages rapid astrometry from professional and vetted amateur stations, and shares standardized notices about geometry, brightness, and uncertainty. Its notices are dry on purpose. They travel with timestamps, not adjectives. A typical bulletin asks for photometry in specific filters, short exposures to avoid trailing, and submissions within a few nights to tighten fits. Nothing in that language points to romance. it points to work, and work is a calming word. Now put that calm beside our puzzle. If a third interstellar traveler has color behavior that refuses to sit politely inside reflection and dust, IAWN does not change its tone. It changes its cadence. Follow-up requested becomes follow-up prioritized. Geometry windows are highlighted with friendly urgency. Stations that have the right latitude and weather are nudged first. The requests speak the language of safety even when the target is not a hazard. That is not a trick, it is a reflex. A network built to reduce risk has learned that disciplined curiosity also reduces surprise. The alibi function emerges from that reflex without anyone ordering it. Publicly, you can say we are coordinating observations because we always do. Internally, you can ask the questions you cannot phrase on a social feed. Is there any persistent blue excess near the core when motion is compensated? Do residuals prefer a small, steady push when last week's astrometry is added? Are there narrow windows where a passing spacecraft or a fast spectrograph could test both ideas at once? These are not conspiratorial questions. They are ordinary questions that stay in ordinary rooms because they are not yet ready to be simple statements. The network provides a place to ask them without theater. Picture a morning meeting in a windowless room that smells faintly of coffee and dry erase marker. A wall screen shows a world map dotted with station codes. The agenda slides have green headers and bullet points that keep their grammar even. An item reads campaign coordination for 3I candidate, geometry favorable for short blue band checks. Another reads residual review, request additional night from southern longitudes. A third says external communications remain standard, no special statements. No one in the room says secret, no one writes engine. The words are all prudent. The effect is momentum without spotlight. Hard anchors keep this from floating. IAWN notices often bundle multiple objects. Meteor showers, close passes by small harmless rocks, and fresh discoveries share space in the same weekly rhythm. Planetary defense exercises run on schedules that were arranged months in advance, and their checklists are visible in public calendars. When a solar storm complicates radio schedules, the network notes it and moves on. This machinery is loud in the places that matter and quiet in the places that would invite drama. It is designed to be blamed for nothing and credited for competence. That is why it works. Grounded speculation can follow the thread one step without overreaching. If a small cluster of color and motion oddities begins to cohere, an internal memo might request specific filters for stations with the right gear, B, V, and a narrow band near the cyanogen region to verify that known lines are not being misread as continuum. Short sequences bracketing rotation phases if a slow, light curve is available. Reduced trailing by adjusting rates to match the object's drift across the field. Submission formats that make it easy to stack radial profiles from different sites. None of this requires new budgets or bold claims. It requires shared discipline and the polite pressure of a network's default voice. The imaginative leap earns a single scene and then stops. Imagine a code name on a draft memo, something bland like Exercise Blue Note. The memo routes to a list that includes teams who manage orbit fits and teams who mine spectrographs. The objective is framed in neutral terms. Cross-check short wavelength behavior near nucleus under motion compensation. Assess non-gravitational terms with expanded nightly coverage. A final line reminds recipients that public messaging remains generic until cross-checks resolve. If you read only the subject line, you see process. If you read the cadence, you hear attention dressed as routine. Transparency is the place where this soft alibi and public trust meet. A network can share that a campaign exists without declaring its thesis. It can publish a brief that says an interstellar object is under coordinated observation for color and trajectory refinement, with results to be archived in standard repositories. It can name which filters are useful and which nights matter. It does not have to say we are testing a rumor about blue light that might imply a machine. It can say we are testing an unusual color profile that could be instrumental or physical. The first phrasing fuels speculation. The second builds understanding. Both protect the work. Only one protects the audience from later whiplash. Here is the open question that can sit beside you without sharpening your pulse. When institutions invoke a network designed for hazards in a week when whispers are loud, are they laundering attention through competence, or are they simply doing what the manual prescribes? The answer can be both. A good alibi is a good process taken seriously. If nothing odd survives the checks, the campaign becomes a paragraph in a quarterly report. If a small, stubborn excess refuses to die, the campaign becomes the archive where the first careful figures live. Either way, the acronym that soothed the room also preserved the data. We close this page by widening the aperture. Networks that handle risk do more than guard us. They set a background hum that can hide many kinds of strangeness in plain sight. When the hum grows a little louder, most listeners do not notice because the song is familiar. In the next chapter, we step back and use a tool we keep for nights like this: the cosmic counterpoint. We place 3IATLAS beside other confirmed anomalies that are not conspiracies at all, only honest puzzles with long half-lives. Tabby's dimming, fast radio bursts, and a cigar-shaped visitor that rewrote a few models. Real strangeness provides cover for imagined strangeness. It also provides context that keeps imagination from running away. We will keep the tone even as the pattern sharpens. Context can comfort or conceal. When the sky offers more than one honest puzzle at once, the mind chooses where to stare, and institutions choose which door to open first. That is the work of a cosmic counterpoint. Place a new whisper beside older, verified strangeness, and the landscape starts to look less like a siren and more like weather. Real anomalies become the fog that cools a fresh rumor. The mood turns careful. The calendar fills with seminars that do not share names. In that softened light, a locked square of pixels, if it exists, looks less like a centerpiece and more like a footnote. That is how cover works when no one intends it to. It is also how a patient investigation keeps its footing. Begin with the star that taught us to speak gently about the extraordinary. A quiet sun in Cygnus dimmed by tens of % on the irregular days. Dust is the modest explanation. Clouds of fine grains drifting along complicated orbits can mute a star without warming enough to roar in infrared. Instruments disagreed about exactly how much dust, and when, and in what shapes, but the broad lesson hardened. Complex natural screens can mimic theater if you meet them at the wrong hour. The megastructure idea made headlines because it was a clean story shaped like a single noun. The truth arrived as a quilt of small, patient facts. Even now, the light curve retains its eccentric grace. The vivid image you keep is simple: a pale sun behind veils that slide and fray, never the same twice, never fully explained, never forcing you to use a forbidden word. When we learn to love veils, we became better readers of blue halos. Now turn to the shouts that last a breath. Fast radio bursts were first, and then became plural, arriving as millisecond pins stuck into the radio sky, most from galaxies so far that the intergalactic medium itself becomes part of the signal. Many repeat, some do not. Magnetars make sense for several of them. Energy stored in twisted fields can crack and ring in a way that fits the shape of the pulse and the power in its tail. A few show periodicities that tease the human appetite for clockwork. Most settle down into patterns that feel natural once you have lived with them for a season. The anchors are clean, durations of milliseconds, dispersion measures that point across the deep, polarization that remembers a violent home. The open question is equally clean. Are we done, or are there families of FRBs that still hide an engine we have not named? The calm answer is to keep listening and to let repetition do its unromantic work. The third counterpoint was our first interstellar visitor, the one that taught humility to light curves. A shard the size of a building rolled in the sun's light and turned brightness into a sawtooth that refused to match a sphere or a familiar lump. The path also betrayed a small, steady push that gravity alone could not own. We called it radiation pressure mixed with outgassing, then argued about what could outgas without leaving a normal dust signature. Some proposed exotic ices that evaporate quietly. Some proposed a brittle, thin geometry that sunlight could push. Numbers were conservative, on the order of a few millionths of a meter per second squared, a daily gain you would miss at lunch and believe at month's end. The imaginative leap was unavoidable and brief. If the shard had been designed to sail, sunlight could have been a hand on its back. Then we returned to instruments and to the long patience of natural explanations. Even at that patience, the shape of the light curve still pinches the mind like a small stone in a shoe. These three do quiet work in our file. They teach style. They teach us to value dust over drama, magnetars over messages, outgassing over intention. They become the standard library for any conversation about a new anomaly. That is good for sleep and for science. It also gives any fresh whisper a ready-made camouflage. If you need to explain why attention is being paid while nothing special is being said, point to the library. We are busy because we are always busy. We are thorough because the universe is generous with puzzles that are more interesting than they are urgent. That sentence is true and protective. It prevents panics. It also allows a particular curiosity to move through rooms while no one has to name it before its profile is clear. Keep a small cluster of numbers in one breath so the mind has rails. A star that dimmed by roughly 20% on days that refused a pattern. Radio pulses that last a few thousandths of a second and travel across hundreds of millions of light years. An interstellar shard with a non-gravitational acceleration small enough to hide in an afternoon and large enough to stand up in a month. Each case birthed networks of observers, processing pipelines, and press notes that learned to emphasize patience. Each case left a residue of fascination after the simplest explanations carried the day. That residue is the fog we are talking about. It is not deceit. It is the honest afterglow of hard puzzles that were tamed by time. Grounded speculation connects the fog to our visitor with the rumored bruise of blue. If you wanted to be careful, you would walk the playbook written by those earlier nights. You would ask for spectra before adjectives. You would ask for multi-station photometry before anyone drafts an op-ed. You would remind the public that emission lines near blue can masquerade as continuum, and that dust behaves like an opinionated filter. You would coordinate through hazard infrastructure because that is where cadence and standards already live. You would accept that a dull sentence in a weekly bulletin can carry more truth than 1,000 bright threads. In short, you would borrow the habits of Tabby's star, FRBs, and the first shard, because those habits kept us honest when we were tempted to reach for larger words. The narrative misdirection is unintentional and still real. A week that includes a complex solar eruption, a lovely meteor shower, a fresh FRB with an odd twist, and a seminar on erratic dimming is a week where public curiosity spreads out. Attention softens. A small team can keep working on a blue question without adding heat to the sentence that explains why their telescope looked where it did. The social version of this is simple. Feeds fill with fascinating, documented strangeness that is not our strangeness. The lab version is kinder. Colleagues share methods that improve our analysis while the thesis stays unnamed. Either way, the counterpoint plays, and our rumor is a quiet harmony line rather than a solo. Hold one vivid image and let it do its work. Imagine a big wall in a newsroom that tracks the sky like weather. Color blocks move across it. A band labeled Solar Wind thickens and slides. A ribbon labeled FRB pops twice and fades. A lane labeled Dimming Flags glows at a small cadence. Near the bottom, a tile labeled Interstellar Visitor blinks at the edge of a schedule. On a smaller monitor across town, a lab plots a radial profile in blue and green and watches the lines refuse to sit on each other near the core. No one lies, no one acts out a script. The world simply has enough honest noise to make any one whisper sound like part of the weather. Now the open question that belongs in a quiet room. Do real anomalies create a background that protects a particular strangeness until it either proves itself or dissolves? Is that protection a kindness because it gives instruments time to breathe, or a risk because it allows a key moment to pass without outside eyes? The answer depends on memory. When the library of counterpoints grew, we learned to be better skeptics. We also learned that a few whispers do survive to become lines on a graph that no one can ignore. The task is to keep both lessons alive. Do not rush to megastructures when dust will do. Do not let dust turn into an excuse not to look where a faint engine might be spending light. The bridge to what comes next is simple and mechanical. Counterpoints provide context. Context is not intent. Our visitor's rumored blue suggests a chamber. The slow daily gain suggested by residuals suggests a hand on the path. When color and motion whisper the same story twice, the human mind begins to draw a word we are careful not to say too soon. Target. If a target exists, the path will tell us where the intention lives, not in poetry, but in geometry. In the next page of the file, we name the theory our own lore has been edging toward. If the blue is the engine and the steady gain is the exhaust, then the map across the starfield is not an accident. It is a choice. We will hold the word intent like a fragile instrument, test it against the numbers, and see if the shape of the route matches something a drift would never pick on its own. Intent hides in geometry. If the bruise of blue is an engine and the gentle daily gain is its wake, then the map across the starfield should begin to look less like a fall and more like a choice. A drifting shard accepts whatever the sun and planets decide. A guided shard chooses corridors. It trims cross-track error. It prefers specific longitudes. It spends light like fuel. A target lock, if the phrase belongs here at all, would not announce itself in a flourish. It would appear as the quiet convergence of small numbers toward a single thread. Start with anchors so the mind has rails. Orbit fitters decompose non-gravitational push into simple components. One points roughly at the sun, one along the path, one out of the plane. They look for persistence. If a transverse term holds its sign for many nights and its magnitude wanders within a narrow band, guidance becomes a sensible word to test. If an out-of-plane term shows a preference that moves the path toward a specific node rather than away from it, intention earns a pencil underline on a whiteboard. No poetry is required. A curve that narrows toward a date and a place is what intent would look like if intent left fingerprints. Now hold a picture that helps more than it tempts. Imagine the dark spindle as a compass needle that does not know north until it learns it. With each slow rotation, a throat opens at the forward waist and feeds a thin halo that leans blue. When the throat points to one side of the velocity vector, the daily push adds a breath of speed. When it points to the other, the push shaves a breath off. Over a week, the average becomes a step. Over a month, the steps line up toward a corridor that the ephemeris calls favorable. The cadence is gentle. The corridors are real. Synodic geometry creates them whether or not anyone chooses them. Locking on is nothing more than refusing to leave the corridor once the corridor is found. What corridors would deserve that refusal? A simple answer is gravity and time. A path that slices near a planet's sphere of influence at the right angle turns small effort into large effect. This does not demand a heroic encounter. A near pass a few million kilometers wide can rotate a trajectory by a few degrees with no drama at all. Another corridor is plasma. Regions near a magnetosphere's flanks and sheets are richer in charged dust and fields than empty interplanetary space. If a mechanism feeds on field gradients or on charged grain dynamics, steering into a neighborhood where those gradients thicken could be sensible. A third corridor is logistics. Windows. When ground networks and cruise craft can watch at once are rare. A patient engine that wants to be seen without being named might choose a week when witnesses are busy for other reasons. None of these require conspiracy to exist. They are features of a sky that rewards those who spend momentum like they have a budget. Testing lock is mechanical rather than mystical. You collect nightly astrometry from diverse stations and let the fitters remove gravity's best version of the path. You watch the residuals as a cloud that shrinks or grows. If guidance is real, the cloud narrows in the cross-track dimension as a particular epoch approaches. The covariance ellipses rotate and tighten toward a small patch of sky. That is the mathematics of a choice. You can hold the check in one breath. Residual slopes that keep their sign. Cross-track dispersion that drops in the 2 weeks before a corridor. A prediction that survives weather and different reduction styles. If those three appear together, the word lock stops being romance and becomes a modest label for a pattern. Course correction has a tone in small bodies. It is not the burn of thrusters. It is the insistence of a heartbeat flattened by geometry. A throat that opens on the same phase, each rotation produces more push at a specific attitude. If the rotation rate is hours rather than minutes, the thrust integrates into what looks like a constant rather than a flicker. A guided object can change that phase slowly by moving mass or by shifting vents. The signature is simple. A small change in the direction of the non-gravitational term over many days, not enough to spin the fit, enough to steer the corridor. Numbers keep this tidy. A daily velocity change measured in tenths of a meter per second. A cross-track correction that grows to a few hundred kilometers by the time a window opens. A slope in residuals that rotates by a small number of degrees over a fortnight. These are not fireworks. They are the handwriting of a careful pilot, even if the pilot is only a mechanism set to a rule. Conservative alternatives deserve light. Seasonal heating can mimic preference. A jet that wakes when the subsolar point passes a seam will add push on a schedule that looks intentional and is not. Phase angle effects can tilt measured brightness and nudge centroids in ways that prefer one side of the path, especially for small instruments chasing a faint head. Star catalogs have quirks that leave color-dependent fingerprints. Even covariance ellipses can lie if the observers all stand on the same longitudes for too many nights in a row. Guidance is the thesis only when those escapes fail. Natural jets choose the sun. Intentional jets choose geometry. That is the line to test with patience. There are destinations that make the word target sound less like cinema and more like shop talk. Lagrange regions are not points you can occupy like a chair, but they are neighborhoods where gentle, continuous push can keep you loitering cheaply. A thin engine that spins light at a steady rate could surf near a planet's nightside L2 without asking for much. If a lock were aiming for such a place, the path would bend toward a slow drift rather than a sharp pass, and the non-gravitational term would need to sit near transverse for weeks. Another is a bow shock or plasma sheet crossing. Those structures have addresses in space and time. Reaching them requires a small rotation of the path and a lot of patience. The best check for either guess is dull. Fit the term. Project the cloud. Ask whether the ellipses walk toward those addresses. If they do not, the guess goes back in the drawer and we return to drift and dust. Grounded speculation can entertain a motive without losing its manners. A mechanism that learns might use a simple feedback rule. Listen for a rise in short wavelength emission from a sheath as the throat rotates. Nudge timing until the rise lines up with a small improvement in cross-track residuals. Repeat. Such a loop would not need a map or a mind. It would only need a way to measure its own glow and a memory short enough to hold 2 nights. Over 30 nights, that loop could look like will. Over 1 night, it would look like a machine that prefers consistency. The romance is ours, not the mechanism's. We see intention in the streamlines because humans are story animals. The data cares only about whether the cloud narrows when a corridor approaches. Allow one imaginative step and no more. Suppose the chamber inside the spindle is sensitive to radio noise that planets make as they comb the solar wind. Whistler waves and hiss rise and fall as a magnetosphere turns. A simple circuit could treat that chorus as a beacon and adjust the phase of a throat to keep the chorus in a sweet spot. The result would be a path that drifts toward the loudest edge of a magnetized region without anyone drawing a map. The color we see at the halo would be a byproduct of the same process that listens. The blue would be guidance and signature at once. You do not have to believe this picture. You only have to admit that the sky gives many levers to any device that can spin photons and measure rhythm. An open question is enough to end the page. If the next 2 weeks of residuals narrow cross-track variance while a transverse push keeps its sign, will we accept the modest word lock as a fair description for what the map is doing? If they do not narrow, will we give the blue back to dust and call the daily gain a patient version of cometary habit? Either answer keeps the room calm. Either answer respects instruments first. In the file we are assembling, a target theory is not a shout, but a pencil line that refuses to erase. In the final page, we will lay the pages on a table and let the softest verdict speak. A leak that named a color, a missing frame that either is or is not, a cadence of process that cooled the room, a map that might prefer a corridor. We will let those 4 threads braid themselves into a whisper, and then we will dim the lights for good. Lay the pages out, and the shape is calmer than the rumors that carried them. A hurried paper with color indices that lean blue longer than they should. A close pass that should have produced a narrow field and image, and a week when publishing slowed for reasons that look like housekeeping. A letter that asks for timelines in polite fonts. A one-word dismissal that cools a room. A hazard network whose cadence grows slightly louder without changing its voice. A cruise probe that offers a quiet checkpoint. None of these items is dramatic alone. Together they form a file whose temperature stays low yet holds a steady pulse. Keep one compact cluster of anchors so the mind has rails. The sun rests near 5,800 Kelvin. Typical comet spectra wear cyanogen close to 388 nanometers, and the swan bands near 516. Dust reddens continuums by habit. A non-gravitational term on the order of a few millionths of a meter per second squared becomes a daily gain of a few tenths of a meter per second, which turns into hundreds of kilometers in a month. None of these values are theatrical. They are the modest numbers that would accompany a thin sheath that emits near blue and a patient push that prefers the same axis night after night. From those rails, the simplest composite story is not exotic, only slightly impolite. Early photometry leaned blue by a few tenths in B-V and resisted the usual corrections. A narrow field attempt was likely scheduled when geometry was kind. A procedural pause created a tidy hole where a quick image might have landed. Public language stayed conservative because cautious sentences survive audits better than lively ones. The rumor stretched each step into a plot, and the plot fits because it needs only friction and timing to move. The phrase cover up looks sharp until you replace it with stewardship under pressure. Mission teams do not lie well, and historians rarely need to prove that. What they do well is sequence communication so that checks finish before adjectives appear. In the outside view, a sequence can look like design because it protects verification. A scheduled quiet hour behaves like a curtain without anyone drawing it shut. The alchemy is social rather than sinister. Routine looks like shelter if you arrive with suspense in your pocket. So the whispered verdict is small and careful. The bluest reading may be a calibration ghost that will fade under a clean spectrum, but the persistence across nights makes a local sheath plausible. A close frame may not exist, yet the odds are decent that an attempt was made and that its products entered a longer review because their rate and filter order were not standard. A gentle, non-gravitational term will likely survive in the fits, and if it points mainly along track with a small, steady sign, it will read more like a machine's patience than like a comet's mood. None of this forces anyone to say engine. All of it allows a listener to keep a very quiet answer close by. If a thin chamber lives beneath a dusted skin, it spins light to sing a short wavelength note, and the song writes a slope across the months. Hold one image, because images help, and then let it go. A dark spindle rolls under a pale halo that is not green and not white, but the color of glacial dusk. The halo brightens near the forward waist, as if a gill opens. Night after night, the path across the starfield peels a little from the silk of gravity's best guess, and then peels a little more, as if small steps had learned to align. The map does not spell a word. It simply narrows toward a corridor in a way that a drift would not. Intent is a big noun. A pencil line that refuses to erase is enough. Predictions are where stories choose to be true or become footnotes. If the sheath is real, a radial color profile taken with motion compensation should show a blue excess that peaks within a few core radii and fades outward. In models, the transverse coefficient should keep its sign within a narrow band for a fortnight, while cross-track dispersion shrinks before a corridor opens. Photometry synchronized to rotation should find that blue excess rises slightly when the same face turns forward. The numbers are round on purpose. Daily delta V near a few tenths of a meter per second. Offsets that grow from tens of kilometers in a week to hundreds in a month. If those figures fail under repetition, the rumor dissolves into calibration and geometry, and the field earns another quiet lesson. 3 questions remain, and none need heat. What sentence would you accept as enough? A caption that reads blue excess near nucleus confirmed, artifact checks passed. Follow-up spectra requested would end a season of guessing with 12 simple words. Which desk will post the first sober figure? A ground-based spectrum could do it faster than any cruise instrument if the weather and filters cooperate. What will the next checkpoint say? A cruise probe's quick look might show only margins that refuse to be perfectly flat, which is still a kind nudge to keep looking when the geometry repeats. Until those answers arrive, this file stays a cabinet of modest, aligned oddities held together by patience more than by plot. The pace slows now. Let the puzzle step back and the room grow larger. You are listening to a universe that rarely shouts and often hums. When it wants you to sleep, it gives you small numbers that add gently, light that leans quietly toward blue, and paths that bend without making a scene. The institutions we built to hear that hum are careful because care keeps rockets honest and archives clean. Care can look like veil and can be used like veil. It is still care. That is a comforting truth on nights when whispers try to sound like alarms. The better habit is to let each clue take the time it needs to become a sentence that anyone can read without squinting. Think of the seasons that trained your skepticism. A star that dimmed by veils until dust felt like poetry. Radio pins that arrived in milliseconds until magnetars became familiar strangers. A shard that sailed a little on sunlight until numbers learned to carry a new term quietly. Each case began as a headline, then became a library entry, then settled into a story you can tell without raising your voice. If the bruise of blue belongs with them, it will become a figure with neat labels, then a paragraph in a paper that uses the word persistent rather than stunning. If it does not belong, it will fade into the catalog of beautiful nearlies that trained our eyes to see better. Breathe with the roundness of the numbers and let the calendar hold your worry. In the next few weeks, a spectrum may land that either lifts the blue out of rumor or returns it to dust. Astrometry will add nights to a slope that either keeps its angle or relaxes into noise. A public letter will become a public reply with dates that either dissolve a gap or admit a hold that never meant harm. A network will file a note that says campaign complete, products archived. Each possibility is ordinary. Ordinary is a safe place to rest. Now widen farther. Picture the visitor as one more patient stone in a night full of patient stones, each turning slowly, each asking for attention paid in days rather than in shouts. If there is a chamber inside, it is small and practical, not a trumpet, not a torch, only a pocket where fields and grains learn to trade energy efficiently enough to leave a tint and a trace. If there is no chamber, then the tint was our eyes learning another trick of dust, and the trace was our graphs remembering how to be honest after a catalog was cleaned. Either way, the cosmos is busy with real work, and you are allowed to sleep while it continues. Close your eyes to the color and hold the cadence instead. Light that leans, residuals that keep their line, a corridor that may narrow, a letter that will answer in rounded time, a probe that either saw a margin or saw nothing and taught us a limit. We have built a file that whispers the simplest possible verdict without borrowing certainty we have not earned. The cover-up, if that word ever belonged, looks more like choreography in a cautious building than like plot. The engine, if it exists, prefers patience over spectacle. The truth, when it arrives, will be delivered in the quiet voice of instruments that know their jobs. Until then, dim the lights and let the numbers hum you to sleep. Good night.